Hey everyone, Necromancer 1040 here. I've got a pretty interesting video for you guys. One that I certainly enjoyed making, but yeah, it's something I've really been meaning to talk about for a while. So I guess the title of this video is really Yu-Gi-Oh has a problem: the fall of trap cards. You can kind of already tell what I'm going to talk about. So I'm really going to talk about how trap cards aren't really played anymore in the meta, how they were once this very commonly used element of Yu-Gi-Oh, and how now they're just pretty much almost non-existent and just relegated to a few trap cards. So yeah, without any further ado, let's get into it. I have a bit of an intro here. So, traps have fallen out of favor in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh. It hasn't been the case for the majority of Yu-Gi-Oh. The common deck back in the day, even since the inception of the game, had 10 traps, 10 spells, and 20 monsters. So for you, some of you newer players, you're probably saying 10 traps, why that many? And that's exactly what we're going to get into today. Because for a large point of Yu-Gi-Oh, wasn't that way. And really, you can attribute, if you look at the top decks from between 2014 to 2015, traps began to see less play within that time from the 2014 and 2015 era. Yeah, you saw some decks that used more traps than others, but that was because they had a specific strategy down. But really, it's within that time period that they kind of uh, you saw a decline. So currently, traps they're mainly relegated to the side deck, and you only see a few of them within the main deck. You may see like six or five. That's probably even generous. You may even see like three or one in the main deck. But that's kind of the setup for this video. So current user traps, like I said, they're mainly relegated into the side deck. They're not in the main deck for the most part. But the traps you do see in the main deck or that are sided in, they're mainly like floodgate trap cards. And part of the reason why floodgate trap cards are used so often is because they have very wide-reaching effects. Effects such as there can only be one, or there can be only one, which mainly kind of tie the game down. They kind of slow it down, and they're kind of used to combat your opponent to really dismantle their strategy, or buy yourself more time in order to get what you need to do in order to win. So it's really these traps that do a lot for you. They're not like the traps in the past that kind of did this one and done ability, and that's all you really saw of them, and they're just done for the turn. Um, so yeah, they have these wide sweeping effects, and other traps that you do see are stuff like evenly matched and infinite impermanence. So I know that seems kind of contradictory to what I just said, but these, well, evenly matched and infinite impermanence, they're kind of like this one and done type of effect. The reason why you use these type of traps is because they behave more like spells nowadays. They're quicker, they're much faster than other traps. Traditional traps, you set them face down and then you activate them the next turn, which is kind of the inherent downfall of traps, or the inherent inconvenience of traps. Like infinite impermanence or evenly match, if you have no cards on the field, you can instantly play those cards from your hand. And that's really why these cards have been useful in top tier formats or like YCSs. It's mainly because they have such a very convenient and quick effect and use to the current modern day strategy. So those were kind of the current uses of traps. So the previous use of traps, I'm going to go into that a little bit more. So mainly, the previous use of traps were mainly used between battle or in battle, or to interrupt your opponent's main phase. Incredibly powerful traps such as Mirror Force, Crush Card, the Crush Card virus, Ring of Destruction, Dimensional Prison, Sakuretsu Armor, Widespread Ruin, Bottomless Trap Hole, Breakthrough Skill, Torrential Tribute. Those are just to name like just a bunch of them right off the bat that I could think of. But these cards were mainly used either between battle, like Sakuretsu Armor or Widespread Ruin, to just basically destroy a monster off the field and basically prevent yourself from taking direct hits, or save one of your most valuable monsters from being destroyed. Um, Another thing is something like Torrential Tribute, to mainly interrupt your opponent during their main phase when they summon something, or even outside of the main phase. Whenever your opponent summons something, it was something that you could respond to and basically foil your opponent's strategy. So you could really see these traps, the previous use of traps especially, they mainly destroyed and negated, and they stalled out the game mainly, or protected yourself from your opponent's monsters and your opponent's spell effects. Um, some traps, such as Seven Tools of the Bandit and Dark Bribe, they saw tons of play. Especially Seven Tools of the Bandit is often regarded as one of the best negation traps, even up to this day. I mean, it's kind of been replaced, um, but for the longest time, it reigned supreme. And these traps mainly, they were meant to stop your opponent's plans, and they were mainly meant to save you. So these were some of the previous uses of traps. And so now we're getting into, now that I set up how traps were used and how they're used in the past and how they're currently used, I'm going to move on to how traps fell out of favor as the problem is in current Yu-Gi-Oh, which I think is a problem. I certainly do. So the game became much more faster. It became the strategies were much more quick. um, Monster and spell card effects assumed the roles of trap cards and trap effects. So certain monsters have protection and destruction and summon or search effects that a lot of traps did have in previous formats, minus the search effects. I mean, some traps do have search effects, but they're few and far in between. But mainly protection, destruction, and summon effects. Those effects were mainly relegated to traps. Um, and so now you kind of see spells and traps assuming that role. Hands like hands hand traps like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. They're much faster traps. They're essentially like a trap card that activates from your hand, but you just discard into the grave as opposed to just chaining it on the field. So yeah, the modern day take of traps in a sense is in the form of these monsters, these hand traps, or even quick play spells. So spell cards became more integral since they also provided draw power and search and summon effects, and they also allowed you to access your resources more readily. This is another way in which traps fell out of favor because spell cards became more useful in terms of drawing, searching, and basically summoning and reoccurring resources, and just seeing what you need to see in a much more quicker way. Um, People kind of saw traps as less than ideal because they say, well, you have to set a trap, and when you draw a trap, it could be a brick. You can't readily activate it. You have to set it first and wait for next turn. And so that's why stuff like infinite impermanence and evenly matched, you see them played more often in the modern Yu-Gi-Oh. And so I guess now that monsters and spells take more precedence in all this and current modern day Yu-Gi-Oh, the goal with monster and spell effects then became more towards like building your board. They were more building your board oriented in a sense, if you understand what I'm saying. So they were really to just set you up and mainly just make this grand board and just kind of hold out the field in that sense, instead of traps holding out the field like they normally and traditionally did in years past and before modern day Yu-Gi-Oh. So like I said, a faster game, and these cards and well, more modern day decks, modern day Yu-Gi-Oh decks, they focus on recoverability. That's another way on how traps kind of fell out of favor. So pendulums kind of helped, I guess in a sense, reduce traps conveniency, since they kind of push this summon heavy kind of strategy, and they kind of didn't really have space for traps essentially. More decks would want to push for a summon heavy mechanic as opposed to this kind of set and pass and stall out the duel kind of strategy that traps kind of did. So because pendulums put more of a summon heavy mechanic, this placed more focus on creating unbreakable boards with monster effects, basically holding out your field. instead of relying on trap cards. You basically have a bunch of monsters with negation effects. One of the most classic examples of this is the Nightmare Lock. If you guys have remember that, the Nightmare Lock is when you had all the nightmare monsters basically creating a U-lock and locking your opponent out of the extra monster zones. And each of these nightmare monsters had their own specific effect that basically either protected themselves when they were co-linked, or basically stopped you from or stop your opponent from targeting or destroying them, or basically being destroyed by battle. All sorts of neat protection effects, and it was unbreakable. It was near unbreakable until Kaiju's came around and kind of changed that. And well, we kind of banned a few of the nightmares, but that's besides the point. But really, that's one of the more classic examples. And because of this, when in the off chance that you did break these so-called unbreakable boards, decks place more of an importance on board recoverability, or board recovery in a sense, where in the event where you were board wiped somehow, whether if it was due to evenly matched, you had you basically wanted to have a faster recovery. So what that means is if all your cards or all your monsters were just blown off the field by something, how would you basically rebuild your board? How would you reoccur resources from your graveyard or from your deck in order to put out basically almost the same amount of monsters that you had before? And so this is really the strategy that decks kind of um, turn to nowadays in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! They mainly said, hey, look, we're going to double down on recoverability. We're not really going to use traps to kind of hold out our board like we normally did. And so yeah, that's kind of how it went. And so spell cards were used more since activated more quickly, and they could rebuild your board a lot more faster than trap cards. Like I said before, because the inherent flaw of a trap card is you have to set it first, because you can't immediately benefit from its effect for in most cases. So that's another way that traps kind of fell out of favor in that sense. Um, so now we get to the problem. Well, why I'm making this whole video is the problem with less traps, or I feel what's the problem now that modern day Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't really use traps as much as in the past. So the problem is with the balance aspect of the game. The game is much more unbalanced. In case you didn't hear me, um, because of the over reliance of spell and monster effects. So spell and monster effects are now the primary source of effects such as negations, search and summon, or protection effects, and removal effects. So the the game is a lot less balanced. So what I mean by that is pretty much like one of the best examples is, let's say you've established your board, and your board has, maybe you have like 5 monsters on the field or 3 really solid monsters on the field that just can negate, and there's just brutally that brutal amounts of attack, and it's tough for your opponent to get around. And then your opponent drops something like Dark Ruler No More, and now you can't really respond to that, because what you've done is you've essentially placed all your eggs in one basket. Your monsters were your direct line of negation. Your monsters were your direct line of destruction. Your monsters were your direct line of interruption. There were all of these effects, and now they get shut off by something like Dark Ruler No More. And this is really the problem why cards like simple cards like Dark Ruler No More, they create such huge problems for the modern day meta. So when someone drops something like Dark Ruler No More, it shuts off your whole strategy for that turn. You can't respond to them for the most part. You're gonna have a very tough uphill battle, and you just can't play. It just shuts it off almost completely. And decks that mainly rely on monsters and spells, well, for this case, mainly monsters, is Burning Abyss. They use maybe like 2 spells, or 3 spells, like Sekka's Light, to just for draw power. And these decks can really fall victim to something like Dark Ruler No More, and just more cards besides Dark Ruler No More, like number 16 Shockmaster, even though he's banned, but also cards like Nibiru and Vanity's Emptiness, which is another banned card. Um, because they completely dismantle your boards, and that's probably the reason, and that is the reason why they're banned. Something like Vanity's Emptiness is it stops all these activation effects. It just freezes up your strategy because the modern day meta has essentially put all their eggs in one basket, and they're relying on just basically the monsters to, well, monsters for the most part, to shoulder their strategy, and they use their spells to mainly set up their monsters to where they want them to be. And being that spells historically aren't able to protect you from other effects, they kind of have this one and done type of deal. You can't really recover in that sense. So something like Dark Ruler No More is very devastating in this effect. And so, like I said before, modern day decks, they put their defense and offense within spells and traps. And so when these monster and spell effects are circumvented, there's almost no line of defense between your opponent's monsters and your precious life points. And so that's mainly the problem. And that kind of leads me into the other problem that I'm going to talk about is because you have no direct line of defense, OTKs and FTKs become more problematic in this kind of meta. So traps activated, they acted as your second line of defense. They were kind of like your failsafe. If your monsters got blown off the field for whatever reason, you at least had your traps set and ready to fend off your opponent so you can kind of reconfigure your strategy. But because you don't have your second line of defense, your opponent is now able to KO you more easily within the turn because they're likely to do a special summon heavy strategy because of their spell search effects or summon effects or whatever it is the case that they access their resources through. So I mean, I know FTKs and OTKs, they have existed in the past, but the problem is now they are much more viable and they are much more likely to exist because we don't use traps to mainly interrupt them or to stop them or to prevent them from becoming, these decks from becoming problematic FTK and OTK decks. And I'm sure if you asked any of your buddies, do they like FTK or OTK decks, the overwhelming majority is they're going to say no, we don't like them. And part of this problem is because there is no second line of defense. You've substituted your second line of defense for board building strategies and basically recovery, which does have its benefits, but like I've said now, it has its sharp inconveniences, its downsides. And so another problem with this trapless or non-existent use of traps is it enables more summon loops. Summon loops or just loops in general. They're now more. They can run more rampant now because there's nothing to interrupt them. There's almost nothing to interrupt them. They can just kind of run their course for the most part freely, unless you have a hand trap to stop them. But even then, you're mainly looking to have just one hand trap or two at most, and that's usually not enough to fend off your opponent's loop strategy. And so, yeah, you're less likely to interrupt your opponent when they're doing these loops. And the problem with these loops is they create very degenerate and unfair strategies, which Konami has kind of mainly combated them with the ban list. But that's a whole nother topic for another time. Maybe I can make a separate video on that. But that's mainly the problem when you hear this term of, oh, it's this degenerate strategy that's kind of cropping up. And I would make the argument that you can attribute it to the lack of trap cards being used. These strategies are much more viable, and they can take on the forms, like, just to name a few, the Firewall loop and the Cypher Lord Omega loop. I don't know how many of you guys have been playing during that time, but I mean, it wasn't too long ago. But man, I sure do remember the Firewall loop, and that was not fun to play through. Um, Basically, if you didn't have Effect Veiler in hand in your first turn, you just lose. You were best off scooping against the Firewall loop. I mean, I could name a bunch of other other bunch of other degenerate loops, but that's besides the point. So yeah, it enables more FTKs, OTKs, and enables these loops essentially, and which is primarily another problem I have with the Yu-Gi-Oh meta. And yeah, and that's the reason why I kind of wish we'd have a return to trap cards. I really do feel if we made a return of trap cards, it would kind of balance things out more evenly. We wouldn't be seeing these FTKs or these loop strategies more often. We would be seeing uh, more nuanced plays because whether you like it or not, I mean, traps they did add a level of strategy and just a whole nother dimension of strategy to the game that we just don't see in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh now as much as we used to. Yeah, I remember when people would use Ring of Destruction to basically during tournaments they'd use Ring of Destruction to basically end in a tie, so they could kind of advance. They could have another shot at winning the next round. They use them in interesting ways like that, and I think it's unfortunate that we don't get to see that nowadays as we did in the past. So yeah, I mean, like I said, like if we return to trap cards, I really feel it could benefit Yu-Gi-Oh as a whole. I'm not saying Yu-Gi-Oh is terrible. Like no, far from it. I mean, Yu-Gi-Oh is. I mean, there's a reason why I play this game. I love it, but I'm just saying this is one of the big problems that Yu-Gi-Oh currently is in, and I feel that it should be corrected in some way. Maybe if Konami made more competitive traps, I mean that's a whole nother topic, but it would be interesting to see that. But yeah, I guess that's pretty much the video, guys. I hope you really enjoyed this video. I mean, I really did enjoy coming up with the topic for this video. It's something I wanted to address for a long time, and I hope you liked it. And I'll probably make more videos that this whole like Yu-Gi-Oh has a problem video. And so yeah, just let me know how much you like this video so I can kind of make more things that you guys would like to see in the future. If you want to support content like this, you can help me out on Patreon. Of course, you don't have to. It's just if you want to solely. But yeah, you can follow me on places like Instagram and Twitter. Just check out the description that I normally post in videos, and you can find me there. But with that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. All right, bye.